The air in the overwater bungalow in Bora Bora was thick with the scent of salt and tiar flowers, a perfume of paradise that Julian Croft had paid a fortune to breathe. Below the glass floor, neon-colored fish darted through crystal-clear turquoise water, oblivious to the world above. He watched Clara, his wife of 3 weeks, as she stood on the private deck, her simple white dress fluttering in the gentle ocean breeze. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and violet, a perfect backdrop for what he believed was the perfect life he had finally built. After years of hollow transactions and calculated relationships, her presence felt like the first genuine thing he had ever owned. He felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost frightening, a fragile happiness he was desperate to protect at all costs. He walked toward her, ready to wrap his arms around her and share the silent beauty of the moment, but stopped when he saw her shoulders trembling. She was not admiring the sunset. She was crying, her sobs quiet and choked, as if she were trying to swallow them. Julian's blissful calm evaporated, replaced by a knot of concern in his stomach. He gently touched her arm, and she flinched, turning to face him. Her green eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were now clouded with a storm of guilt and desperation he had never seen before. "Clara, what is it? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice soft, still trying to pull her back into the perfect fantasy they were living. Her lips parted, but for a long moment no sound came out, only a ragged breath that carried the weight of a secret. "I have to tell you something," she finally whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. "I wasn't honest with you." "Julian." He waited, his expression shifting from concern to confusion. The confession tumbled out of her in a torrent of shame and fear. "I have a son. His name is Leo. He's 5 years old, and he's sick, Julian. He has a heart condition, and he needs a surgery I could never afford." Each word was a physical blow, striking the foundation of his newfound happiness until it fractured. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a mask of cold disbelief. He was not just hearing about a child. He was hearing that their entire relationship, the whirlwind romance he believed was a miracle, was built on a calculated, desperate lie. He, the man who controlled empires, had been played for a fool. The humiliation was immediate and absolute. The silence that fell between them was heavier than any words could have been, broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves against the stilts of their bungalow. Julian did not shout or rage. He simply took a step back, the small distance feeling like an impassable chasm. He turned his back on her and stared out at the horizon, his posture rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The man who had been glowing with love moments before was gone, replaced by the cold, guarded titan of industry he had always been. He saw his reflection in the darkening glass of the door, a man who had everything and nothing. It is a devastating thing to witness someone's heartbreak so completely, to see their one true hope revealed as a lie. We tell these stories because they are real, and your subscription is what allows us to continue sharing them. The idyllic dream shattered into a million silent pieces. Julian remained with his back to her, a statue carved from ice and betrayal, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon. The vibrant colors bled from the sky, leaving behind a cold, bruised twilight that mirrored the desolation in his heart. Every word of her confession echoed in his mind, twisting his beautiful memories into grotesque caricatures of deceit. The woman he thought was his salvation, the one pure thing in his calculated world, was just another transaction. He had not been loved. He had been targeted. The humiliation was a physical poison, seeping into his veins and turning his profound happiness into a bitter and hollow ache. He felt the fool, the ultimate mark, played by a girl with innocent green eyes and a story designed to break the bank, and his heart right along with it. This feeling of being used was a ghost that had haunted him his entire life. He remembered being a boy, no older than Leo, wandering the cavernous, silent halls of his family's estate. His parents were phantoms, present only in the form of trust funds and notes left with the nanny. They gave him everything money could buy, a fortress of possessions, but never the warmth of a genuine embrace or the simple comfort of their time. He learned early that affection was conditional, that people saw his last name before they ever saw him. This upbringing forged him into a man who trusted numbers and contracts far more than people. He built an empire as a defense mechanism, a wall of wealth so high he thought no one could ever touch the lonely boy hiding inside. Clara had not just climbed that wall, she had been invited in, only to plant a flag of deceit in his most vulnerable territory. Clara's voice, fragile and trembling, tried to cut through the suffocating silence between them. She didn't offer excuses or pleas for forgiveness, only the raw, unvarnished truth of her desperation. She spoke of Leo, not as a pawn, but as the entire reason for her existence. She described the night spent by his hospital bed, the terrifying sound of his strained breathing, the doctors who spoke in cold, clinical terms about surgical options that cost more than she could earn in a lifetime. She painted a vivid picture of a world he couldn't possibly comprehend, a world of constant fear, mounting debt, and the crushing weight of knowing the one person you love most is fading away. Her story wasn't a strategy. It was a prayer from a mother who had run out of options and had made a deal with a devil she hoped had an angel's heart. Julian's response was a chilling, absolute silence. He made a single phone call, his voice clipped and devoid of all emotion, arranging for 2 separate flights back to Los Angeles. The journey home was an exercise in quiet agony. He sat alone in the sterile luxury of the first-class cabin, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating on the table beside him, the hum of the engines a monotonous drone in the background. Clara was somewhere behind him, in coach, a physical and metaphorical distance he had imposed with brutal efficiency. He closed his eyes, but the image of her tear-streaked face was burned onto the back of his eyelids. It's a terrible thing to inflict such cold, calculated pain on another person, even when you feel you have every right to. We share these difficult moments because they are part of the human story, and your subscription is what allows us to keep these truths coming to light. Before Julian Dusk, Clara's life was a landscape of muted greys and suffocating anxiety. Her world was a tiny one-bedroom apartment where the smell of stale coffee and antiseptic wipes always lingered in the air. Her days were a frantic blur of juggling a low-wage waitressing job, navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of medical insurance claims, and monitoring Leo's fragile health. There was no room for dreams or desires for herself. Every waking thought, every ounce of her energy, was dedicated to her son. She would lie awake at night, listening to the soft, rhythmic puffing of his oxygen machine, her heart constricting with a fear so profound it felt like a physical illness. She was trapped in a cycle of poverty and despair, watching her child's life hang by a thread that was becoming thinner with each passing day, with each denied claim and each sympathetic but helpless look from his doctors. Leo was the sun around which her entire universe revolved. He was a small boy with his mother's bright green eyes, but they were often clouded by a weariness that no 5-year-old should ever know. He loved drawing superheroes and watching cartoons, but he could never run or play like the other children in the park. A simple game of tag would leave him breathless, his small chest heaving and a faint blue tint coloring his lips, a terrifying visual reminder of the faulty valve in his tiny, struggling heart. Clara's most vivid memories were not of laughter and games, but of holding his small hand in the sterile, white environment of an emergency room, whispering promises that everything would be okay. Promises that felt more and more like lies, as their options dwindled and the medical bills on her kitchen table grew into an insurmountable mountain of debt. Back in the sterile, panoramic emptiness of his Los Angeles penthouse, Julian was assailed by the voices of his world. His lawyer, a man who specialized in protecting assets, advised a swift and ruthless annulment, framing it as a simple matter of fraud. His friends, the same ones who had toasted his whirlwind romance, now spoke of Clara with detached pity or smug derision, calling her a gold digger and a master manipulator. Every conversation reinforced his deepest, most cynical beliefs about the world, that he was a target, that his wealth was a magnet for deceit, and that genuine connection was a fool's fantasy. The external pressure was immense, a chorus of voices urging him to cut his losses, erase the mistake, and retreat back into the safety of his emotional fortress. Locking the gate firmly behind him, this was his chance to prove he was still in control. He sat at his glass desk, the annulment papers laid out before him, the pen heavy in his hand. He was ready to sign, to sever this cancerous growth from his life and cauterize the wound with legal ink. But as he reached for the document, his fingers brushed against a small, crinkled photograph tucked into his wallet. He didn't remember putting it there. It was a candid shot he'd taken of Clara on one of their first dates, laughing at something he'd said, her face illuminated with a joy so pure and unguarded it seemed impossible to fake. The image was a stark contradiction to the calculating predator his mind and his friends were painting her to be. It was a ghost of the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had fallen for so completely. How can one person be both a desperate mother and a cunning liar? If you have ever felt torn between your head and your heart, subscribing to our channel helps us explore these complex human questions together. The photograph planted a seed of doubt that Julian couldn't ignore. His pride was shattered, but his analytical mind, the very tool that built his empire, kicked into gear. He couldn't reconcile the two versions of Clara, so he did what he always did when faced with a problem. He launched an investigation. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about facts. He hired a private investigator, a discreet professional he kept on retainer for high-stakes business intelligence, and gave him a simple directive: find out everything about Clara and her son. He needed a complete picture, untainted by emotion or her desperate narrative. He would process this personal catastrophe like a hostile takeover, gathering data, assessing liabilities, and then making a final, calculated decision based on cold, hard evidence. It was the only way he knew how to regain a sense of control over the chaos she had unleashed. The investigator's report landed on his desk less than 48 hours later, a thick manila folder that felt as heavy as a tombstone. It contained the unvarnished, brutal truth of Clara's life. Page after page detailed Leo's medical history: a congenital heart defect, a series of escalating complications, and a stack of letters from doctors recommending a specific, prohibitively expensive surgery as his only real chance. It also contained police reports Clara had filed against Leo's biological father, a man with a long history of violence and addiction, from whom she had fled with nothing but her son and a bag of clothes. The story she had told him in Bora Bora wasn't the whole truth. It was a sanitized version. The reality was infinitely more desperate and dangerous than she had let on. She hadn't just been poor. She had been running for her life. Driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, Julian went to the address listed in the report. It was in a bleak, neglected part of the city he usually only saw from the windows of his limousine. He found Clara not in a state of emotional collapse, but sitting at a small, rickety table under a flickering fluorescent light, surrounded by stacks of medical forms and insurance statements. She was methodically highlighting sections and making notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. The air in the small apartment was thick with the scent of rubbing alcohol and the low, persistent hiss of an oxygen concentrator. There was no sign of the elegant, carefree woman he had married. In her place was a warrior, exhausted but unbroken, armed with a ballpoint pen and a mother's unyielding will to fight for her child's life. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply observing. He saw the worn-out sofa that doubled as her bed, the second-hand toys piled in a corner, the quiet dignity in her posture. Then his eyes fell on the small bed tucked against the far wall. Leo was sleeping, his small face pale and peaceful, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm dictated by the machine beside him. The sight of the child, so small and fragile, was like a physical blow. This was not a concept or a part of a story anymore. This was a real boy, fighting for every breath in a world that had dealt him an impossible hand. In that instant, the towering edifice of Julian's anger, his wounded pride, and his humiliation crumbled into dust. All that remained was the profound, aching reality of the scene before him, and a dawning, terrifying empathy he had never felt before. Without a word, Julian had driven her and Leo to the hospital, the silence in the car a heavy blanket of unspoken emotions. The sterile scent of antiseptic hit them the moment the automatic doors slid open, a smell Clara knew all too well. A doctor with tired eyes met them in a private waiting room, explaining in clipped, urgent tones that Leo's condition had deteriorated rapidly. An arrhythmia had weakened the valve further. He needed the surgery now, not in weeks, but in hours. The doctor presented a clipboard with consent forms and financial liability documents, the total cost a staggering figure that made the air leave Clara's lungs. She looked at Julian, her eyes pleading, not for his money, but for a strength she no longer possessed. He stood by the window, his expression unreadable, a silent judge presiding over the most important trial of her life. Just as Clara reached for the pen with a trembling hand, a loud, aggressive voice echoed down the corridor. A man with a cruel sneer and cheap cologne swaggered into the room, his eyes immediately locking onto Julian's expensive watch. It was him, Leo's biological father, a ghost from a past she had fought so hard to escape. "Well, well," he said, his voice laced with venomous greed. "Looks like my son hit the jackpot. I heard you married a rich man, Clara. I'm his legal father, you know. Nothing happens, no surgery, no nothing, until we come to an arrangement." He was a vulture circling, seeing not a sick child, but a winning lottery ticket. Clara felt a cold dread wash over her, a primal fear that paralyzed her completely. Her past and present had collided in the worst possible way, threatening to destroy her son's only chance. Julian watched the scene unfold, a silent observer, no more. He saw the predator in the man's eyes, the raw terror on Clara's face, and in his mind's eye he saw the pale, sleeping face of the little boy in the other room. In that instant, his own wounded pride, the sting of betrayal, the humiliation, it all turned to ash. It was no longer about him being deceived. It was about a child who was innocent in all this, a child whose life depended on the actions of the adults in this room. He thought of his own childhood, of the echoing, empty halls, and the feeling of being utterly alone and unprotected. He would not let that happen to this boy. A cold, quiet resolve settled over him, the kind of clarity he usually felt before a hostile takeover. But this wasn't business. This was family. He took a single step forward, placing himself between Clara and the other man. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried an absolute authority that cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "Get out," he said simply. The man scoffed, but faltered under Julian's unwavering gaze. "You have no legal standing here, no financial relevance, and no paternal rights you haven't already forfeited. You will leave this hospital now, or my security will remove you. You will not contact Clara or the boy again. Is that clear?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on the man, a complete dismissal, and faced Clara. He gently took her hand, his touch firm and reassuring. "He is not your problem anymore," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "Leo is our son, and I will take care of our family." With those words hanging in the air, a promise that rebuilt their shattered world on a new foundation, Julian walked over to the nurse's station. He took the clipboard from the stunned doctor, his movements fluid and decisive. He didn't even glance at the astronomical figure listed at the bottom of the page, the sum that represented Clara's entire mountain of fear and desperation. He simply uncapped a pen and signed his name on the line marked Parent Guardian Responsible Party. The stroke of the pen was firm, a black line of ink that was not just a financial guarantee, but an unbreakable vow. He was no longer Julian Croft, the betrayed husband. He was Leo's father, a title he had just claimed not by blood, but by a deliberate, profound act of love and commitment, finally erasing the lie that had brought them together. The hours during Leo's surgery were a lifetime of silent prayer and shared fear. Julian and Clara sat in the sterile waiting room, not speaking, but connected by a fragile thread of hope. When the surgeon finally appeared, his scrubs a pale green against the stark white walls, his smile was the sunrise they had been desperate to see. The procedure was a success. Later, standing over Leo's small bed in the recovery room, they watched the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a sound that was no longer a source of terror but a beautiful, life-affirming melody. Julian reached out and gently brushed a stray hair from Leo's forehead, his touch impossibly tender. In that quiet, shared moment of overwhelming relief, looking at the sleeping boy and the woman beside him, Julian understood that his life hadn't been destroyed by a lie. It had been saved by one. The transformation that followed was profound and absolute. Julian didn't just pay for a surgery, he built a family. The first step was legal, but the act itself was pure love. He formally adopted Leo, and the day the papers were signed, he held the small boy in his arms and whispered, "You're Leo Croft now, you're my son." They left the cold glass penthouse behind, moving into a warm, sprawling house with a backyard big enough for a boy to run in. Julian, the man who once lived by his calendar, started delegating. He sold a significant portion of his company, trading board meetings for school pickups and billion-dollar deals for bedtime stories. He was discovering a richness he never knew existed, a wealth measured not in stock prices, but in the sound of a child's unrestrained laughter echoing through the halls of their home. Julian's newfound purpose extended far beyond the walls of his own home. He saw their story not as a private miracle, but as a calling. With Clara by his side as an equal partner, he established the Leo Croft Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing critical medical funding for children with congenital heart conditions and offering comprehensive support for single mothers fleeing abusive situations. He poured his wealth, his business acumen, and his entire heart into it, creating a legacy that turned their personal pain into a beacon of hope for countless others. He was no longer just a man who sold expensive cars. He was a man who gave families a second chance, who built bridges over the chasms of despair he and Clara had so narrowly crossed. His fortune, once a shield against loneliness, had become a tool for connection and healing. 5 years later, on a sun-drenched afternoon in their backyard, the past felt like a distant country. Julian watched Leo, now a healthy, vibrant 10-year-old, chase a soccer ball with boundless energy, his laughter carrying on the breeze. Clara came and stood beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder, their hands intertwining naturally. There were no ghosts here, only the peaceful, profound reality of the life they had built together. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was real, forged in the crucible of a desperate lie and redeemed by an unconditional love. He had learned that a family isn't something you are born into, but something you build with courage and forgiveness. Seeing their journey from betrayal to this beautiful, quiet peace reminds us that the most powerful stories are about choosing love against all odds, and it is your support that makes it possible for us to continue sharing them.